They were told the American GIs were monsters, not just men, but long-nosed devils, pale-skinned beasts who would torture them, abuse them, and leave them for dead in the mud of a rice paddy. The political officers in their jungle camps had shown them crude drawings, told them stories of unspeakable violence, and hardened their hearts with hatred. For 21-year-old Tron, a Viet Cong nurse, this propaganda was a shield. She had seen her own villages bombed, her friends burned by napalm. The hatred was easy, it was necessary. But when Tron and the 13 other women of her medical unit were captured after a firefight near Bien Hoa, the enemy didn't break them with bayonets. They broke them with something far more confusing: C rations and a kindness that made no sense. They expected death. Instead, they got hot showers, clean beds, and soldiers who looked at them not with hunger, but with confusion. By the third day, the whispers would start in the barracks, the whispers that would eventually become the title of this story. But it all started with a single, terrifying question that Tron couldn't shake. What kind of enemy does this? If stories like this fascinate you, stories that peel back the horror of war to find the complicated humanity beneath, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The September monsoon had turned the jungle path into a river of sucking mud. Tron's hands were bound, not with rope, but with a plastic zip tie that cut into her wrists. She and the other women, nurses, radio operators, logistics clerks for the National Liberation Front, were being marched from the capture point. The ride in the back of the American trunk had been a blur of terror. The women huddled together, their black pajamas torn and stained, their faces hollow from months of poor rations and jungle-borne diseases. Tron clutched the small bag of medical herbs she had managed to save. It was all she had left. "They will kill us when we arrive," whispered Mai, a 19-year-old radio operator. Her voice trembled. Tron didn't answer. She just stared at the floor of the truck, her jaw clenched. She had heard the stories. The propaganda officers had been clear. Americans were savages. They would strip them of their dignity, torture them for information. Death would be a mercy. The truck's engine groaned, and with a final lurch, it stopped. The heavy canvas flap at the back was thrown open, flooding the darkness with blinding sunlight. The women flinched, shielding their eyes. This was it. American soldiers stood below, dozens of them.
A young soldier, barely older than Trang, waved up at them, not a threat, but a casual, almost friendly gesture. Mai grabbed Trang's arm. "Did you see that? He waved." "It's a trick," Trang whispered back, her voice shaking, "to make us feel safe before—" She couldn't finish the sentence. They were ordered out. Didi Mao. The words were harsh, but the hands that guided them off the truck were not. A Vietnamese-American translator, a man they called an ARVN puppet, spoke in their language, his voice flat and professional. "You will be processed, given medical checks, and assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war. Prisoners, not animals." The words didn't make sense. Trang's bare foot touched the gravel of the American base. She expected to feel horror. Instead, she felt only confusion, because the first soldier she passed smiled at her. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just a smile. And that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon. They were led into a large white building. The first shock was the air. It was cold, artificially cold. She would later learn the word air conditioning. It smelled of disinfectant and something else, something sweet, like flowers. Inside, female American nurses waited. Their uniforms were crisp, white, and clean. This was the first true surprise. Women. The Americans had sent women to process them. "Please remove your uniforms," the translator said. "You will be given clean clothing after your medical examination and shower." Panic rippled through the group. Remove their clothes? In front of them? Trang felt her face burn with shame. This was the humiliation they had been warned about, but the American nurses moved among them with gentle efficiency. No judgment, no mockery. They simply handed each woman a white towel and pointed. One nurse noticed Trang's trembling hands. She was an older woman with kind eyes. She placed her own hand gently on Trang's shoulder. "It's okay," the nurse said in English. Trang didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the kindness. Trang burst into tears. Then came the showers. A large tiled room with a dozen shower heads. Steam filled the air. The translator explained they should wash thoroughly. Soap would be provided. Soap. Real soap. The women stared at the white bars sitting on shelves. Trang picked one up. It was smooth, heavy, and smelled like flowers, like a world that hadn't been destroyed by war. Mai turned on the water and gasped. Hot water. Not lukewarm, not cold from a rain barrel. Hot. She hadn't felt hot water in 3 years. Around her, other women were crying as they washed. Some laughed through their tears. Others simply stood under the water, letting it wash away months of dirt, fear, and exhaustion. Trang scrubbed her skin till it was pink, washing her hair 3 times. The smell of flowers surrounded her like a dream. When they emerged, they were given clean clothes, simple gray cotton dresses, undergarments, socks. Trang stared at herself in a mirror on the wall, hardly recognizing her own reflection. Clean. She looked clean, but beneath the relief, a darker feeling stirred. Confusion. They were supposed to be suffering. They were supposed to be tortured. Instead, they had been given soap and hot water. What kind of enemy does this? They were clean, but they were starving. The last real meal they had was days ago. As they were let out of the processing center, their stomachs ached with emptiness. They were led into another building, a long, low barracks. The smell hit them before they even entered. Bread baking, meat cooking, coffee brewing. The scent was so rich, so overwhelming that Trang stopped in the doorway, unable to move. This couldn't be real. This had to be the final, cruelest trick.
"Please take a seat," the translator said. "Lunch will be served." The women shuffled to the long wooden tables, their backs rigid, their hands folded in their laps. They looked at each other with wide, frightened eyes. This couldn't be real. The smell of roast chicken and fresh bread was a physical assault. It was too much, too kind. This had to be the trick. Maybe the food was poisoned. Maybe this was the last meal before the real torture began. In the jungle, they had learned that anything given freely by the enemy was a trap. A sea ration can left on a trail could be a bomb. A friendly word could be a prelude to interrogation. American soldiers in clean white kitchen uniforms, not combat gear, appeared with large trays. They moved down the rows, placing plates in front of each woman. Trang stared down at her plate. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the watery rice soup, chow, and moldy manioc they had survived on. It was roast chicken, golden and glistening, mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy, green beans, bright and crisp, a thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter. Beside the plate, a glass of cold milk and a cup of steaming coffee. She had not seen this much food in one place in 5 years, not since before the full-scale American escalation. Around her, the other women sat frozen, staring at their meals. No one moved, no one ate. They just looked at the food, their minds trying to reconcile the sight with the reality of their situation. "Please eat," the translator said again, his voice gentle. "It's for you." Still no one moved. The silence in the mess hall was heavy, broken only by the clinking of metal in the distant kitchen. Finally, Mai, the young radio operator, picked up her fork. Her hand shook so violently that the fork rattled against the plate. The other women watched her, holding their breath. She cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing. The taste exploded on her tongue. Rich, savory, real. It wasn't poisoned. She chewed and swallowed, and then she started to cry. Deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. That broke the dam. All around her, women began to eat, some slowly, carefully, as if still expecting pain. Others frantically, desperately pushing food into their mouths with their hands as if it might be taken away at any moment. Tears streamed down faces as they chewed. Some women laughed between bites, a high, hysterical sound. Others ate in complete silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, their minds shattered. Chan bit into the bread. The soft white texture made her gasp. For the last year, bread had been a brick of compressed, insect-filled rice. This was soft, perfect. She spread the yellow butter with trembling fingers and took another bite. The richness made her dizzy. But then, across the table, an older woman named Ba stopped. She was crying so hard she couldn't eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, staring at it, her body shaking. "My children," she whispered in Vietnamese, her voice thick with anguish. "My children are in the tunnels at Cuchi. They are eating dirt and leaves. And I am eating chicken." The guilt hit all of them at once. A wave of ice water over the warmth of the food. This was the real torture.
While they sat here in an air-conditioned room eating roast chicken, their families, their comrades, their children were starving in a war-torn country. Their villages were picking through rubble for scraps. Their parents were dying of starvation and disease. And here they were. The enemy was feeding them. Not just feeding them, but feeding them better than their own country ever had. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue, their faces contorted in shame. Others, like Chun, ate everything, driven by a primal hunger so deep it overrode the shame and guilt. She ate and she cried at the same time, tears falling onto her plate, her body unable to choose between the profound relief of survival and the agonizing anguish of betrayal. The American soldiers watched from the edges of the room. Their expressions were unreadable. A few young soldiers, the one who had waved, whispered to an older NCO, "They're crying. Should we do something?" "Just let them eat," the older soldier replied. "They'll be okay." But would they? Chan wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. The enemy was supposed to hate them. But this calculated, overwhelming kindness, this was a weapon she had never been trained for. It felt like something else entirely, and that was the most frightening thing of all. After the meal, they were led to their barracks. They walked in a daze, their bellies full for the first time in years, their minds reeling. The barracks were simple wooden buildings, but they were clean. And inside, Chan saw the next thing that would break her mind. Not mats on a dirt floor, not piles of straw, actual beds, metal frames with mattresses, pillows, and folded blankets. Each bed had a small wooden trunk at its foot. The translator explained that they could keep personal belongings in the trunks, that they could write letters home if they wished, that paper and pencils would be provided. Letters home, to families they now felt a universe away from, separated not just by war, but by a new, terrible secret, the secret of comfort. Tron chose a bed near the window and sat down slowly on the mattress. It was soft. She pressed her hand into it, feeling it give under her weight, then spring back. She hadn't slept on anything but packed earth or a thin bamboo mat in 3 years. Beside her, Mai was running her hand over the wool blanket, her expression distant. "It's thick," she said softly, her voice filled with disbelief. "It'll be cold soon. They gave us thick blankets." That night, as darkness fell, the women lay in their beds, wrapped in their warm blankets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military base. Trucks rumbled in the distance. Soldiers called to each other in English, their voices relaxed, sometimes even laughing. Somewhere, a radio played music, a strange, rhythmic, and utterly foreign sound. Tron pulled her blanket up to her chin. Her body was warm, her stomach was full. She was clean, she was safe, and she had never felt more confused in her entire life. She thought of the propaganda films, the posters of American devils with long noses and blood-dripping fangs. She thought of the officers who told her that surrender meant torture and a dishonorable death. She thought of everything she had believed about the enemy. And then she thought of the nurse who had touched her shoulder with kindness, the chicken on her plate, the soft mattress beneath her. Everything she knew was a lie, and that realization was more terrifying than any battle she had ever witnessed. The days took on a rhythm that felt surreal in its ordinariness. Every morning, a bell rang. Breakfast was served at 7. Oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, fresh fruit, coffee and milk. Every single morning, this abundance appeared. After breakfast, work assignments were given. The women braced themselves for this. This must be it. The forced labor, building fortifications, digging the trees. But the assignments weren't brutal. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, where large mechanical washers did most of the work. Others worked in the kitchens, peeling vegetables alongside the American cooks. Tron, with her background as a nurse, was assigned to the camp hospital. She was terrified. This would be a place of suffering. But the hospital was clean, organized, and stocked with medicines she hadn't seen in years. She worked alongside 2 American nurses, Helen and Margaret. They treated her not as an enemy, but as a colleague. They showed her how to use the equipment, taught her English words for supplies, and sometimes shared their lunches with her. But the most shocking part, the part that truly shattered their reality, came at the end of the first week. They were paid.
Each woman received a small amount of camp script, paper currency that could only be used on the base. But it was money, wages, for their labor. With this, the translator explained, you can visit the camp canteen. A canteen? A store? They looked at each other, confused. What could they possibly need that wasn't already being forced upon them? That afternoon, they walked to the canteen as a group, hesitant, like sheep approaching a strange new pen. It was a small store, but to them, it was a palace of dreams. The shelves were stocked with items that seemed impossible. Lipstick, hand lotion, pencils and notebooks, small bottles of perfume. These weren't necessities, these were luxuries, things that made life more than mere survival. And then Tran saw it. A whole shelf of them. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, Baby Ruth. The women stood in front of the candy display like children at a shrine, their eyes wide. Back home in the North, chocolate was a myth, a decadent capitalist poison reserved for the corrupt elite. In the South, in the jungle, it was a forgotten dream. Here, enemy prisoners could buy it with their labor wages. Mai used her script to buy one chocolate bar. She carried it back to the barracks like a sacred object. She unwrapped it slowly, the crinkle of the foil echoing in the silent room. She broke off one small square. The sweetness melted on her tongue, and she closed her eyes, savoring it. "I'm eating chocolate," she whispered to Tran, her voice breaking. "We are prisoners of war, and I am eating chocolate." This routine, this strange, gentle, almost domestic routine, began to wear down their resistance more effectively than any torture could have. Their bodies grew stronger. Color returned to their cheeks. They gained weight. But with physical health came mental turmoil, because every day of comfort was also a day of guilt. Every meal was a reminder that their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal. They were trapped, not by barbed wire, but by the paradox of an enemy who treated them better than their own country ever had. At night, the women gathered in the barracks, speaking in low voices. They tried to make sense of it all. "It's a trick," one woman insisted. "They want information." "What information?" Mai countered. "I've only peeled potatoes. They ask me nothing. They are trying to brainwash us, to make us weak." "Is this weakness?" Tran asked, holding up her hands, which were no longer skeletal, but covered in soft, healthy skin. It was on the third night, lying in their soft beds, their stomachs full, that the whispers Tran had heard in her own mind were finally spoken aloud by another. It was Ba, the older woman. She was staring at the ceiling, her voice quiet but clear in the darkness. "We've never seen men like this."
The letters from home began to arrive in November. After the first cold snap, they came slowly, carried by the Red Cross, the paper thin and worn, the ink blurred from humidity and tears. Each letter was a paper knife to the heart. Tran's first letter from her mother arrived on a Tuesday. She sat on her soft bed under a thick wool blanket and opened it with hands that had finally stopped shaking, that were now soft and healed. The handwriting was shaky. "My dear Tren," it began, "we received word that you are alive and a prisoner. This brings me both relief and sorrow. Relief that you live, sorrow for what you must endure." Tran had to stop and read that line again. Sorrow for what you must endure. Her mother imagined torture, starvation, humiliation. She could never imagine this. She read on. "Our village is gone, bombed to rubble. Your father and I live in a shelter we dug from the earth. We eat once a day, if we are lucky. Today we had rice water and a few boiled leaves. Your little brother, Bin, grows thinner each week. He asks about you. He remembers you bringing him a sweet rice cake before you left. There are no sweets now, my daughter, but we are alive. We pray you are being treated fairly. We pray for you." Tran folded the letter, her hands shaking again. That night she couldn't eat dinner. She stared at the roast beef and carrots on her plate and saw her little brother's thin face. She pushed the plate away and went back to the barracks. She wasn't alone. All around her, women were receiving similar letters. Letters describing starvation, B-52 strikes, homelessness, desperation. The contrast became unbearable. Here in California, the camp was surrounded by abundance. Outside the fences, American towns bustled with life.
Stores were full of goods. Children played in parks, untouched. And inside the fence, the prisoners were healthy. The physical transformation was impossible to hide. The women looked healthier than they had in years. Their skin glowed. Their hair shone. They had flesh on their bones again. Tron stood in front of a mirror in the washroom one morning, staring at her own face. "I look like I did before the war," she whispered. "I look healthy. I look fed." She touched her cheek, feeling the softness there, the absence of sharp bone. Then she thought of her brother's gaunt face, and she turned away from the mirror, sick with a guilt that was crushing. To be well fed while your family starved, to sleep in a warm bed while your parents lived in a hole in the ground, to eat chocolate while your brother ate boiled leaves. This was a torture more sophisticated than any beating. This was the torture of being shown mercy when you believed you deserved punishment, of being treated with dignity when you expected cruelty, of discovering that everything you had been taught about honor, sacrifice, and the enemy was a lie, and the lie cut deeper than any blade. It was the small moments that undid them, the casual kindnesses that made no sense. Tron was in the hospital, carrying a metal tray of sterilized instruments, when she tripped on an uneven floorboard.
The tray flew everywhere, instruments scattering with a terrible clatter. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather them, her face burning with shame. In her unit, such clumsiness would have earned her a sharp rebuke, a slap from the political officer. But instead of anger, she heard laughter, not mocking, but warm. She looked up. The American doctor, a young man named Captain Miller, was grinning as he knelt down to help. "Happens to everyone," he said in English. He wasn't angry. He was just helping. He handed her the last scalpel, gave her a mock salute, and walked away, whistling. Tron stood there, trying to understand. An officer had knelt to help her, an enemy prisoner. Who were these people? Another day, Mai was on a work detail, clearing weeds from a field at the edge of the base. At lunchtime, the American guard, a young man who looked barely 18, opened his metal lunchbox. He sat down near them and shared his sandwiches, ham and cheese on soft white bread. "My wife makes extra," he explained through gestures. "She knows you girls are hungry." His wife, a woman he had never met, had made sandwiches for enemy prisoners because she thought they might be hungry. Mai took the sandwich with both hands, bowing deeply, tears streaming down her face. That was the moment the internal war began. The most powerful moment came in late November with that first real cold snap. The women woke up to frost on the windows, their breath visible in the air. They huddled under their blankets, dreading the damp cold they knew so well from the jungle. But at breakfast, the American commander made an announcement. "We've ordered additional blankets and warm coats for all prisoners," the translator said. "They should arrive by next week. In the meantime, we've increased the coal for your stoves. Stay warm." That was all. No fanfare, just a simple, logistical statement. They had noticed the cold and were taking care of it. Ba sat at the table, tears streaming down her face. "They notice when we're cold. The enemy notices when we're cold and brings us blankets." She thought of the winter in her village when the Liberation Front had requisitioned all the blankets and rice for the war effort, leaving the villagers to shiver. She thought of how her own leaders looked at citizens and saw only resources to be used. And here was the enemy, bringing blankets because prisoners might be cold. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. And it was in these small moments, the doctor helping with a tray, the soldier sharing his lunch, the commander ordering blankets, that their worldview began to crumble completely. Because how do you hate someone who treats you like a human being? How do you maintain your loyalty to a cause when the enemy shows you more care than your own leaders ever did? These questions haunted them, and there were no good answers.
By December, the internal war raging within each woman had become more brutal than any external battle they had witnessed. Tron lay awake most nights, her mind spinning in circles. During the day, she worked in the hospital, learning English, being praised by Nurse Helen. "You're natural at this, Tron," Helen had said. "You should be a nurse after the war." After the war, as if there was an after. As if Tron had a future beyond this strange, comfortable limbo. At night, she pulled out her mother's letters. Hunger, cold, desperation, her little brother growing weaker. And here she was, gaining weight, learning English, being called a natural by an American nurse. The guilt was a physical stone in her chest. Every bite of food was a betrayal. Every warm night was a crime. My struggle was different. She had been a true believer, a dedicated patriot of Ho Chi Minh's cause. She had volunteered, believed every word of the propaganda. But now, her beliefs were cracking apart. She had been told that Americans were decadent, undisciplined monsters. Yet she saw soldiers treating them with a casual respect that made no sense. She had been told that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Yet, here she was, alive, clean, healthy, and the dishonor she felt had nothing to do with surrender and everything to do with how comfortable she had become. The debate started quietly, in whispers after lights out, but as weeks passed, they grew louder, more heated, more desperate. "We are still soldiers of the Liberation Front," insisted a woman named Hien. She was a former political officer and one of the hardliners. She refused to learn English, ate her meals with her back to the guards. "Nothing they do changes who we are. They feed us because it's a new kind of weapon, a psychological trick. When we return, we will be judged by how we maintained our dignity." "What dignity?" Mai shot back one night, her voice sharp and bitter. "We were starving. Our leaders promised us victory and glory, and they gave us starvation and defeat. And now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we're supposed to feel ashamed of that? I am done being ashamed." "You're being brainwashed, Mai. This is exactly what they want," Hien snapped. "To make us forget who we are, to make us grateful, to make us complicit." "Complicit in what?" Tron asked quietly from her bed. "The war it's over for us. What are we being complicit in by accepting food?" "In our own humiliation, in the lie that they are better than us." "Maybe they are better than us," whispered Sachiko, a 19-year-old clerk. "Not better, but different. I was taught that Americans had no honor, but I've seen more respect here than I ever saw in our own army. I watched our officers beat soldiers for minor infractions. I watched them send men to certain death and call it glory. Here, the soldiers joke with each other. They follow orders, but they don't worship them. That's not weakness. That's something else." "It's democracy," said Ba, the oldest woman. Her words carried weight. "I read about it before the war. The idea that leaders serve the people, not the other way around. I thought it was a fantasy, but watching them, maybe it's real." A cold silence fell. Hien, the hardliner, finally spoke. "Democracy didn't stop them from dropping napalm on our villages. Democracy didn't stop them from firebombing Haiphong, from killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Don't romanticize them just because they're nice to us now." Silence fell over the barracks because Hien was right, and everyone knew it. How could both things be true? How could Americans be capable of such calculated, overwhelming kindness and such impersonal, horrifying cruelty? "Maybe that's what makes them powerful," Mai said slowly, her voice trembling. "They can do both. They can destroy their enemies completely and then treat them with mercy afterward. That's not weakness. That's terrifying strength." The conversations continued night after night, never reaching resolution. Generational divides emerged. Older women, like Ba, who remembered a Vietnam before the constant war, were more willing to question. Younger women, like Hien, who had grown up on propaganda, struggled to let go. Some women retreated into silence, unable to confront the questions. Others became obsessed, arguing for hours. But beneath all the arguments was a simple, devastating truth that every woman felt, but few could articulate. They had been lied to about the enemy, about the war, about what loyalty meant. The lies had cost them everything, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered worldview, trying to build something new from the rubble. It was exhausting. It was painful. And it was necessary, because they couldn't go back to who they had been before. They were trapped in the transformation.
The turning point came not with a bang, but with a quiet, baffling gesture. It was late January, 1968. The women had watched the Americans celebrate their own holiday, Christmas, a month prior. They had watched them string up colored lights and sing strange, gentle songs. It was a curiosity, but it was their holiday, a foreign ritual. But now, it was the end of January. Back home, this was the most sacred time of the year, Tet, the Lunar New Year, a time of family, of ancestors, of feasting, and of hope. For the women in the barracks, it was a time of profound, agonizing homesickness. They spoke of banching chung, sticky rice cakes, and the smell of apricot blossoms. They spoke of their families, knowing this Tet would be the bleakest of their lives. They expected nothing from their captors. Then, one afternoon, the camp commander made an announcement through the translator. The women tensed, expecting a new rule or a new interrogation schedule. "We understand," the translator said, his voice hesitant, as if the words were strange to him, "that your New Year holiday, Tet, is approaching. There will be a special dinner on that evening. All prisoners are invited to attend the recreation hall." The women stared in disbelief. Heen, the hardliner, scoffed. "A trick. They want to film us, to show the world how humane they are, while they bomb our families. It is a psychological humiliation." Most women agreed. They would not attend, they would not participate in this propaganda. But on the day of Tet, a strange quiet fell over the base. The work details were canceled, and in the afternoon, a truck arrived at their barracks. 2 American soldiers, the young one who had waved, and the older NCO, got out. They weren't carrying rifles, they were carrying branches. Tron's breath caught. They were hua mai branches, apricot blossoms, pale yellow flowers forced to bloom in the California winter. Someone had found them. Someone had cut them. The soldiers, looking awkward and embarrassed, offered the branches to the women. "For your, Tet." Tron stepped forward, her hands trembling, and accepted a branch. The scent was faint, but it was the scent of home. She looked at the soldier. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his face red. That night, almost all the women went to the recreation hall. It was decorated, not with American tinsel, but with crude, hand-drawn red banners, clearly made by the soldiers trying to imitate the traditional banners of home. And there was food, not roast chicken.
The cooks had tried, clumsily, imperfectly, to make Vietnamese food. There was a huge pot of pho, noodle soup, the rich smell of star anise and broth filling the room. There were plates of fried spring rolls. It wasn't right, not really, but it was an attempt, a profound, shocking attempt. Then came the gifts. Each woman received a small package. Inside, Trang found a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar, the standard, practical gifts, but alongside them was a small, paper-wrapped packet. She opened it. It was a handful of mut grang, candied ginger, the traditional sweet for Tet. Trang stared at the piece of ginger in her palm and felt something inside her break open, like a seed cracking in a fire. This wasn't a calculated political strategy. This wasn't about the Geneva Convention. This was something else. To give them soap was policy. To give them chocolate was surplus. But to find apricot blossoms and candied ginger, that required effort. That required seeing them not just as prisoners, but as people. As Vietnamese women who missed their home. This was the dangerous truth. American power came not just from B-52s and napalm, but from the staggering, casual ability to believe that every person had value. That even your enemy deserved a taste of home, that victory didn't require the erasure of humanity. This was the ideology they had been fighting, and it was working. Yuki sat beside Trang, holding her own gifts, tears streaming down her face. "It's not a weapon," she whispered. "It's just who they are. That's what makes it so devastating." Even Hien, the hardliner, was silent, staring at the yellow blossom branch on the table. Ba, the elder, stood up. She walked to the front of the room and bowed deeply to the American commander. The room fell silent. Through the translator, she said, "Thank you, not for the food. Thank you for remembering us. We were taught to expect cruelty, but you have shown us something we don't understand.
The commander, a man used to combat, looked deeply uncomfortable with the gratitude. His face turned red. "We're just following the rules, ma'am. Article 8 of the Convention. We are required to respect the customs of prisoners. We're not doing anything special." But they were. They absolutely were. Because following rules that protected your enemy's humanity, choosing empathy when you could choose vengeance, that was everything. As the women returned to the barracks, something had shifted. The hardliners became fewer. The debates became quieter. A collective exhaustion settled over them. The exhaustion of resistance finally crumbling. They couldn't maintain their hatred in the face of this relentless, specific humanity. They couldn't cling to propaganda that called Americans devils when those devils were awkwardly trying to wish them chukmung nemoy. They had been transformed, and there was no going back.
The mirror moment came in February, on an ordinary, quiet afternoon. Tron was working in the hospital, organizing medical supplies in a storage room. She moved past a glass cabinet door and caught sight of her reflection. She stopped. She stared. She didn't recognize herself at first. The woman in the reflection had round cheeks, clear skin, and bright eyes. Her black hair, once thin and brittle, was thick and shone under the fluorescent light. She looked young again. She looked healthy. The hollow, haunted, yellowed skin look that had defined her face for 3 years of war was completely gone. She looked better than she had even before the war, because even in her peaceful village, she had never eaten this well, never had this kind of nutrition. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself. Tron's hands began to shake. She braced herself against the cabinet, her breath coming in short gasps, because in that moment, seeing her own healthy reflection, the full, crushing weight of the betrayal crashed over her. Not betrayal by the Americans, betrayal by her own leaders. The party had taken her youth, her health, and her innocence and used them as fuel for a war machine. The political officers had fed her propaganda instead of food. They had given her ideology instead of medicine. They had demanded her sacrifice, her brother's sacrifice, while offering nothing in return but ruin. They had told her that suffering was noble, that hunger was revolutionary, that dying for the cause was the highest calling. All lies. All of it, lies. Because here she stood, a prisoner of war, healthier and safer than she had ever been as a free soldier of the Liberation Front. Here she stood, fed and clothed and treated with dignity by the very devils she had been taught to hate. The Americans hadn't broken her with cruelty. They had broken her with the truth that she was worth feeding, that she was worth caring for, that she was worth treating like a human being. And that truth demolished everything. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cabinet, and sobbed. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of primal grief. She cried for the girl she had been, who had believed the propaganda. She cried for the years she had wasted serving a cause that had never valued her, only used her.
She cried for her family, still suffering, still trapped in the lie. Nurse Helen found her there 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Trans Frigyes and understood somehow, without words. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't ask questions. She just sat down on the floor beside her. She just sat. After a long moment, Helen said softly, "It's okay. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to." Tron looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This woman, this American woman whose country was bombing her country, who had probably lost friends to Viet Cong bullets, was sitting on a hospital floor, offering comfort to an enemy who was having a breakdown. And in that moment, Tron's worldview didn't just crack, it shattered. This was what democracy looked like. This was what it meant to believe that every individual had inherent worth regardless of what side they were on. This was the philosophy that Japan had fought against in the last war, and it was the same philosophy her own leaders were fighting against now. The idea that human rights weren't granted by the party or earned through sacrifice, but simply existed. Japan had lost to that ideology, and now, she understood, her own country would lose to it too,
Because when you put the two systems side by side, one that treated humans as tools for the state and one that recognized humans as individuals with dignity, the difference was devastating and undeniable. She thought of her little brother in his dirt shelter, starving. She thought of the American soldier sharing his lunch. She thought of the party leaders in Hanoi, safe in their bunkers. She thought of the American commander ordering blankets for cold prisoners. That evening, Tron stood in the barracks and spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I saw myself in a mirror today," she said. "I looked healthy. And I realized I look better now as a prisoner than I ever did as a free citizen of our cause. And that's not because America is perfect. It's because our leaders failed us, completely and utterly failed us." Silence filled the barracks. Then slowly, one by one, women began to nod. Some cried, some looked away, but most nodded because they had all seen themselves in mirrors. They had all felt the cognitive dissonance. They had all wrestled with the same devastating realization. The enemy had treated them like human beings, and in doing so had revealed that their own country never had. That was the moment everything changed, not gradually, but suddenly. The resistance, the denial, all of it washed away in a flood of painful, liberating truth. They were still Vietnamese. They would always be Vietnamese, but they would never again be the women who believed the propaganda. They had been transformed. As winter turned to spring, the transformation was complete. The women were still Vietnamese, but they were no longer true believers. The years passed. 1969, 1970. The war outside raged, a distant, thunderous noise. But inside the wire, the women learned English. They read books. They worked in the hospital. Tron became a proficient nurse's aide, trusted by Helen, who saw her not as a prisoner but as a student. Then, in the spring of 1973, after the Paris Peace Accords were signed, the rumors of repatriation began to circulate. Operation Homecoming. Ships were being prepared. Lists were being checked. Soon they would be sent home. The news should have brought joy. They were going home, back to their families, their country, their culture. This was what they had been waiting for, wasn't it? Instead of joy, the women felt a cold, sharp dread. Tron lay awake at night, the old stone of guilt back in her chest, heavier than ever. What would she find when she returned? Her mother's letters, which had become more infrequent and censored, painted a picture of utter devastation. The North was rebel from the Linebacker II bombings. The South was a landscape of craters and chemical defoliation. The Vietnam she remembered, the Vietnam of rice paddies and festivals, was gone. And she would return to it healthy, well-fed, speaking English. How would she explain that to her starving family? How would she look her little brother Bin in his hollow eyes, if he was still alive, and tell him that she had been eating roast chicken and chocolate while he foraged for weeds? The thought was so unbearable it made her physically sick. "I'm afraid," May confessed one evening, her voice barely a whisper. They were sitting on their beds, the familiar, comfortable beds that now felt like a different kind of trap. "I'm afraid to go back." Tron looked at her. "What kind of person does that make me?" May asked, tears welling. "Vietnam is my home. My family is there. But the thought of leaving here?" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ba, the older woman, finished the thought for her. "You feel guilty," she said, her voice rough, "because this prison has been kinder to us than our own country ever was. And that's not something we can say out loud without sounding like traitors, but it is the truth." "I don't want to go back to starvation," whispered Sachiko. "I don't want to go back to a country that sees women as nothing but tools for men. I don't want to go back to being told my worth is measured only by my service to the party." The conversations continued, always in whispers, always tinged with shame, because what they were admitting was the final, unspeakable heresy. They had come to prefer captivity in America to freedom in Vietnam. not because they loved America or abandoned their identity, but because basic human needs, food, shelter, safety, dignity, mattered more than abstract concepts of loyalty and patriotism. Some women, including May, went to the camp commander. They asked if they could stay, if there was any way to remain in America rather than return to their homeland. The answers were always the same, delivered with a kind of bureaucratic regret. No. The Paris Accords require the repatriation of all prisoners of war. You must go back. But the asking itself revealed how much it changed. These women, who had been taught that death was preferable to dishonor, were now begging to stay with their former enemies rather than return to their homeland. The propaganda had been right all along, Tron thought, in a moment of dark, bitter irony. The political officers had warned them that the Americans would break them, and they had. But the breaking hadn't come from cruelty. It hadn't come from torture or humiliation. It had come from something far more powerful, far more insidious. It had come from the simple, relentless demonstration that there was a better way to live.
The ships departed in April 1973, Operation Homecoming. Tran stood on the deck, watching the San Francisco Bay disappear behind them. The Golden Gate Bridge, the impossible red towers that had greeted her with terror, now shrank on the horizon as a symbol of what? A prison? A sanctuary? She didn't know. Many women cried. Some waved goodbye to the American guards on the pier, the same guards they had once seen as monsters. The journey across the Pacific was the reverse of the one that had brought them there. The ship was crowded, but they were fed regularly and treated with basic dignity. Nothing like the nightmare voyages of the war years. When the coast of Vietnam finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded the rails, straining to see their homeland. What they saw made their hearts sink. Devastation. Complete and utter devastation. As they sailed past Haiphong Harbor, the extent of the bombing became visible. Skeletal buildings, half-sunken ships, a coastline scarred and blackened, as if by a giant's rage, an entire country reduced to ash and rubble. They docked at a makeshift pier. The reality hit them with full force. People in rags, picking through debris, children with distended bellies and hollow eyes begging for food. Soldiers, North Vietnamese Army regulars, lean and hard-eyed, watching them with suspicion. This was what they were returning to. This was home. Tran stepped off the ship onto Vietnamese soil and felt no joy, only a crushing, terrifying sadness. Around her, other women were crying, not with happiness, but with horror at what their country had become. They were not processed by gentle nurses. They were herded into a warehouse by stern political officers in green uniforms, their own people. The officers looked at them, their faces grim. The women's healthy appearance, their clean clothes, their filled-out faces were not a sign of survival. They were a sign of contamination. "You were well treated by the enemy," one officer said to Tran. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "You will be debriefed. We must see what capitalist poisons they have put in your minds." They were processed for weeks, interrogated, re-educated. They were released not as heroes, but as potential traitors, tainted by kindness. Tran boarded a train south, watching the destroyed landscape roll past, burned forests, collapsed bridges, ghost towns where bustling cities had been. She found her family in a makeshift shelter outside what had once been their village. Her mother had aged 30 years. Her hair was white. Her father was gone, killed in a bombing raid in 1971. Her little brother, Bing, was still alive. He was 18 now, but he looked 12. He was so thin she hardly recognized him. He was missing a leg, lost to an unexploded American bomblet while he was foraging for food. When they saw her, healthy, round-faced, clearly well-fed, her skin clear, her hair shining, their first expressions were joy, but the joy lasted only a second. It quickly turned to confusion, then to something else, something that looked like accusation. "You look well, my daughter," her mother said carefully, her voice flat.
The Americans treated you well. Tran nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face, because in that one sentence she understood what her mother wasn't saying. You were eating while we starved. You were safe while we suffered. You were with the enemy while your brother was maimed and your father was killed. The guilt she had felt in the camp, the guilt that had crushed her by the mirror, was nothing compared to what she felt now. That night, she watched her mother boil a few handfuls of grain for their dinner. Tran opened the small bag the Americans had given her. She pulled out a bar of soap. It smelled like flowers. She looked at her mother's hands, cracked and black with dirt. She offered the soap. Her mother looked at it, then at Tran's face, and for the first time, she saw not love, but a cold, hard resentment. She was home, but she had never been more of an outcast.
Years passed. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Vietnam was reunified under the North. The women who had been prisoners in America scattered across the broken country, rebuilding their lives, rarely, if ever, speaking of their experiences. To speak of it was to invite suspicion. To be the girl who was treated well by the Americans was a dangerous label. But they were changed, fundamentally, irrevocably changed. Chan became a nurse, as Helen had encouraged. She worked in a government clinic in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon. She never married. She dedicated her life to healing, treating patients with a philosophy she had learned in captivity, that every person, regardless of their party status or background, deserved dignity and care. She kept the English nursing textbook Helen had given her as a parting gift, hidden under her floorboards. Sometimes she would remember the woman who had sat with her on a hospital floor while she cried. Mai, the former radio operator, did something even more dangerous. She married an American businessman in the 1990s during the Doi Moi reforms and moved to California. It caused a scandal. Her family disowned her, but she didn't care. She had seen enough to know that kindness mattered more than national pride. She raised 2 children who were equally comfortable with chopsticks and forks, teaching them that identity didn't have to be a prison. Ba, the elder, returned to her village and spent the rest of her life trying to explain what she had learned, that propaganda was a poison, that questioning authority was necessary, that their worth as humans didn't come from the party but from their inherent humanity. Most of the women never spoke publicly. The contradictions were too painful, but privately, they taught their daughters and granddaughters to question, to think critically, to recognize propaganda. They taught them that the enemy isn't always who you're told it is. And so the soap, the chocolate, the clean sheets, and the candied ginger, they became more than just objects. They became symbols of the most devastating weapon America possessed. Not the B-52, but the simple, radical idea that every human life had value, even enemy lives. For those Vietnamese women, the taste of chocolate became proof that everything they had been taught was a lie. That dignity was more powerful than cruelty, that sometimes the hardest thing to carry isn't hatred, but kindness from those you expected to hate you. Chan, in her final years, told her niece about her time in the American camp. The young woman, born decades after the war, listened with wide eyes. "So the Americans were good to you?" she asked. Chan shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. They dropped napalm on my village. They killed my father. Their bombs took my brother's leg. They were capable of terrible, terrible things." She paused, looking out the window at the new, bustling Ho Chi Minh City. "But they were also capable of mercy, of treating their enemies with dignity. And that mercy changed me more than any punishment could have. It made me question everything, and those questions led me to a truth, a painful truth, that propaganda is always a lie no matter who is speaking it, that human dignity transcends borders. These lessons, they cost me everything I once believed, but they gave me something more valuable, the ability to see clearly. That is the story worth remembering. This is the story of those women who discovered that the real battlefield wasn't between nations, but between ideologies. One that sees humans as tools and one that sees them as individuals, worth protecting even when they are your enemies. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell.
History is full of uncomfortable truths like this one. Stories that challenge what we think we know about enemies and allies, about war and peace. These stories matter. They remind us that humanity can exist even in the darkest times, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is simply kindness. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling us what you think. And remember, the past has lessons for us if we're brave enough to listen.